what we wanted to do is talk about the implications of what Heather just showed you when things become a little bit more real in the real world, and how that's important. So you see there that there's a big variability. There's a group of kids who are doing really very well, just like typical kids, and a group who are not. And that probably helps us to identify folks who have some risk and maybe who can be targeted for intervention. So we call this thinking meets worrying, what happens next, because when these are not really done in a vacuum outside of the real world. So what do we know? We've known for a long time, and there's plenty of reports in the literature, that kids and adults with the 22q deletion have a range of different cognitive impairments, and those limit competence in numerous domains. But they vary widely among the individuals, and they also vary widely across age. And sometimes they don't completely resolve, but they improve significantly over age. So there's a lot of variability here, and we need to sort of use that variability to understand things some more. We also know that despite, and this is what we've learned from our clinic, really strongly from the clinical work, that despite severe cognitive limitations in some cases, which is IQs in the mid-60s range, which means people are 60% of where they should be for their age intellectually, we're seeing some of those very same kids outperforming the predictions of that testing, while others fall very far short, who may have much higher levels of intellectual ability when they're tested. So we've started to call those in our lab in some recent publications the copers and the strugglers. So copers tend to show low levels of anxiety and but high levels of real-world functioning, which is called adaptive functioning. And Kathy will talk more about this later. And they actually are doing much better in the real world and in school than would be predicted by their intellectual testing. So they really do look like they're doing much better than we might expect. And the strugglers tend to show the reverse pattern. They're kids who have more anxiety and poor adaptive functioning, and they tend to have worse academic patterns. And then the question for that is, what does that mean? What situation does that put you in every minute of every hour of every day? So our work is now beginning to focus on what we're calling cognitive affective interaction. So the affective is sort of the emotional or sort of stress, anxiety, behavioral part of this, to show how the relationship of these two powerful forces sort of influence one another in really a bi-directional sense. There is not a chicken and an egg. These things are happening in both directions at the same time. This allows us a much sharper focus on how to optimize learning, increase quality of life, possibly reduce risk for psychiatric outcomes that are severe, and this is really going to be the focus of our work going forward. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work that actually that Heather also did based on some previous stuff in the lab, and then Josh is going to tell you about what happens when we kind of turn the knob a little bit on this task. So you've often heard me talking about attention, and I'm going to come back to attention for a moment here. So what is attention? Attention is a process for selecting and filtering. We have too much information in the world that we can focus on at one time, and the purpose of attention is to resolve competition for our cognitive resources between multiple things in the environment. Which things should I literally pay attention to? Okay? And in science, we call this top-down and bottom-up. So top-down is when it's controlled by goals or plans. I'm looking for my keys that I left on the table. I have a goal to find them. This is sort of a volitional search. I'm trying to find things. But they can be bottom-up, which is driven by events or objects in the world. You're walking through the park and a golf ball comes whizzing by. You turn around and you pay attention to it. So you can be driven by sort of internally driven things coming from the brain, and you can be driven by things coming from the environment. And I don't want to go into the brain science of this too much, but this is a kind of a cool picture. So what we see here is that when someone is doing a top-down volitional thing, focusing on work, there's actually a brain network. The orange part is what's turned on, and the blue part is sort of what's suppressed. But when something in the environment that one thinks is important or interesting happens, just like that, which drew your attention over there, in this case somebody in the next cubicle, or here, that can actually switch the brain systems and you focus on something completely different. So you suppress one thing at the cost of the other. So here, this was sort of lit up in the thing, now it goes dark and this is lit up in the world, or you switched attention over here. Okay, so, and what we also know is that there are different brain networks for this. Again, I'm not going to get too much into the brain system, but I want to draw attention to the fact that this talks about sensory information, sensory salience or sensory importance, and this talks about reorienting or filtering. Where do you move your attention? So this begins to come to the question of, okay, what's relevant or salient in the world? Okay, I can tell you I think something is salient, but it may not feel like that to you, and that depends on the situation that you're in. Okay, so what's This is generally defined in what we call cold objective terms. So, you know, in a lab experiment, Heather says, hey, you know, the mole and the vegetable are salient. The kid might be thinking, I don't want to be in this room at all. This is pretty horrible. I think you're the salient thing, or this computer is, right? So we're now trying to think about what happens when things get a little bit hot. Okay, what happens when the emotional and the biological piece of this is actually interacting with all of that. So let's quickly talk about cold cognition and see what we see there, and then what happens differently when we talk about hot cognition. So this is another experiment we do in the lab. It's called exogenous or endogenous attention. The exogenous means outside of yourself, and endogenous means inside of yourself. So the endogenous is the volitional top-down, and the exogenous is the event-driven. Okay, so in each case, the kids see a screen like this with 4 boxes on it, and in one situation, they would see an arrow in the center that says pointing to this location, which is basically telling you, move your attention from the center to this box here, and you either get a valid cue where this little cute little alien shows up in the place where we cued your attention, happens 80% of the time, or an invalid 20% of the time. So then you have to reorient your attention before you can respond, okay? And this is basically how long it takes. In the other version, you see the 4 boxes, and one of them will flash, okay? So there's an object in the world happening. You don't have to generate that. You respond to it, and then we basically have a 50-50. The reasons for the 50-50 versus the 80-20 are technical, but we won't go into that now. Basically, this is top-down, brain-driven, external-driven, okay? And we published these data, and one of the interesting things to see is we looked at both within the child, how things differ when they do one versus the other type and between the 2 groups. So again, 7 to 14-year-old kids with a 22q deletion typically developing controls. And what we see is that we measure something called Q cost. And Q cost is how much extra time does it take you to respond when we sent you to the wrong location and you have to reorient back to the correct location. Okay? So what you can see here is that there's no difference between the groups when there is this external thing. When the thing flashes and the world tells you, orient your attention here, the kids with the 22q deletion are barely any worse than the typical kids. They're doing just as well. But when you have to generate that, where do I want to move my attention to based on some information, they do a whole lot worse. Okay? So that's a selective impairment. It's not just they're bad at everything. They're only bad when they have to generate that for themselves. But interestingly, that difference only in the endogenous top-down volitional, whatever you want to call it, only existed. You see, there's no real difference between the typical kids, between the younger and the older. But there was a huge difference in the kids with the 22q deletion. So the younger half of the kids were much worse than everybody else, but the older half of the kids were really actually a little bit better than the typical kids. So this is something that really improves over time. And there wasn't really a difference in the exogenous, external-driven one in any group by age. So basically that's set up in the brain pretty early on and doesn't really change. Now, the only problem is that 7 to 10 or 7 to 10 and a half is a pretty important period of time. Right? It's the first few grades of school. So not a good time to be impaired in terms of figuring out where to pay attention to stuff. So that can be a problem. And so it may be that these copers who are well matched to their environment may actually be doing a whole lot better than the kids who are struggling. And so even though they may be less impaired, or they may be less affected by the impairment. So that's what happens here. So we see that there is an improvement, which was the opposite kind of improvement we saw with the task that Heather just showed. But this is in the sort of not very biologically relevant situation. Who the heck cares about cute little aliens popping up on screens? What happens when we turn it into a real, slightly more wild and hairy and woolly situation?
So in this case, we have what's called the dot pro threat bias task, in which, first of all, a child will see a cross in the center, and then they're presented with two faces, so a face pair. These faces vary from angry neutral, or happy neutral, or neutral neutral. And by the way, these faces all come from a standardized set developed by Minton and Hanover at UCLA to demonstrate that they're very recognizable faces to emotion. Okay? So after the faces appear, a star appears in one space, and they have to respond to that, whether it's the left or right side. So basically, what we're trying to see here is that do kids orient their attention towards things that are more threatful or just more salient to them? Okay, so basically the hypothesis is that those kids who orient themselves to more negative affect will ultimately have increased or elevated anxiety. So basically what this means is, this is kind of what we have so far. Our sample sizes are a little bit small, especially in the typical kids, but what we see here is that, laser point here, is that, okay, so basically, like the Q cost that Tony mentioned earlier, anything that you see positive means that kids are orienting themselves towards the more emotional phase. So here we have angry, and then here we have happy. So you notice that in the typicals, they both orient towards the neutral phase, or essentially the non-emotional phase. While as in the 22Q, while as kids with 22Q, for angry, they seem to orient themselves to the negative affective phase, so the angry phase right here. But they also do not seem to orient themselves to the happy phases. So what this means is that potentially that there is this kind of cause that generally kids with more anxiety or just kids in general just seem to be more oriented towards the more negatively affective phase. So basically, threat bias is thought to increase anxiety risk, and we have a couple correlations that suggest this. All right. So one thing to note is that even though we do separate out the groups between the typically developing and the kids with 22Q, we're really looking for just anxiety versus performance. So here we can see that when we compare to the what's called the multi-dimensional anxiety scale for children, a lot of your parents have filled this out, is that we see a general trend with angry bias right here. So as angry bias, so as kids are more negatively, as kids orient them, so those kids who orient themselves towards the more negatively affective phase, you'll notice that they have increased scores on the mask. So here we have harm avoidance, and here we have general, or just anxiety disorders. So as negative affectively, attentionally biased kids goes up, you'll also notice a corresponding increase in the anxiety scores. And then you also, one thing you'll also notice here is that you'll see that within the typical developing group as well. So essentially this is not a difference between anxiety on 22Q and typicals, it's just an overall trend effect. All right, so here that we see angry bias, but when we look at the happy bias scores, right here, we do get the opposite effect, which is kind of what we expect. Because based on the whole relative negative affective hypothesis that we're trying to instill, we see that as kids orient, so basically this is kind of a flip of what the angry bias scores look. So here we have a positive correlation, or not really correlation, but a positive trend with the anxiety scores with increased negative affect. But with happy bias, you notice that kids that are more oriented towards the happy, so they're more positively affected by stimuli, that anxiety scores go down as well. So you can also just see this as a flip version in case where those kids who orient themselves to the more neutral phases, or basically in this case, so since they're paired with the neutral and the happy phase, they're perceiving the neutral phase as being more negatively affective. So you notice here that so those kids who orient themselves towards the neutral phase often do have, are trending to show a little bit more anxiety compared to those that are more towards the positive affective phases. So one thing that you noticed earlier is that when we talked about the exo task, you see that there was no difference between the older and the younger group when you on performance. But here, when we separate out our kids, using a median split, so whereas the younger group is about 10.5 years and younger, and the older group is about 10.5 years and older, we see that there is this kind of negative affect relation to anxiety, or to anxiety within the younger group. So the left side right here is the younger group, and on the right side here is the older group. So here we see a trend on the younger group in that those kids who are more oriented towards the negative affect, we see a general increase in anxiety, whereas with the older kids, it's relatively flat. I mean, we only have about 7 kids so far, but we pretty much see just kind of a spread right here. Okay, and then the same is seen with the harm avoidance scale. Here we see that as negative affect goes up, attention towards negative affect goes up, we see that the younger kids seem to be more, there's a relationship in the younger kids as opposed to the older group right here, which even though it's showing a negative trend, there's really no real pattern that's showing right there. Okay. Let's see there. So this also holds true with the happy phase. So what's interesting to note is that younger kids seem to not to relate onto the positive affect. So here we see a generally flat trend with the younger kids, while as the older kids, you'll see that those that have the more positive tension towards affect seem to have lower anxiety, whereas those that are oriented towards the neutral, or in this case, the more negative affect, often have higher anxiety as well. So determining why is this case, why is it different for the happy, we still don't quite understand that yet, but we hope to move forward and kind of get more understanding as we go along, as we increase our numbers. And the same pattern happens here. You'll see that with the harm avoidance scale, there's a general flat trend right here within the happy bias, as opposed to with the older kids, in which you see basically only a slight trend down. But I mean, you see more of a pattern here with the older kids than you do with the younger kids.
So let me just summarize it. What Josh showed you was something very interesting, I think, that when we start to put the children into a hot cognitive situation when there's threat going on, we don't know the chicken and the egg, but what I think he showed rather nicely is that when we put these threatening situations, and you can avoid them or not avoid them, that some kids will be drawn very much to the either angry face, which is threatening, or away from the more calming face, the more neutral one, which some people see as slightly threatening. And that correlates with the amount of anxiety that they have. So we don't know the chicken and the egg here. There's a thought in the literature that's emerging that this kind of test shows you people who will maintain their threat, and they will essentially set themselves up for being more anxious over time. And so that sort of puts you into that struggler category more than the coper category. So we want to be able to kind of reduce that, okay? Is that clear to everybody, what we're kind of seeing there? And so, you know, this is actually a potential place for intervention very early on, and a place where we want to target. So that's one thing. Where do you draw your attention to? And if you think about why do they not look at the eyes, you see that in autism. Does anybody have a dog here? Do you know what happened? I've got a bite mark on the end of my nose because I have a puppy at home, and I did the same thing. But if you stare right into your dog's eyes, what will it do? It'll look right away from you, won't it? So if you're slightly concerned, you know, people stare you right in the eyes, they're going to look away. So that's a sign that there's sort of some threat there, okay? So Heather showed you this before. I don't need to go over it all again. Here was our wonderful whack-a-mole task, and we showed that the kids who did this, we had a pretty good accuracy on the go trials, and we had this difference on the no-go trials, and that the kids were able to essentially pick up this difference between the probability of something going to happen, but not actually be able to restrain themselves from making an inappropriate response. But in the end, you know, who cares about whacking moles and protecting vegetables? It's not the most important thing in your life, okay? So what happens when something really, really counts, and how does it make you feel? Because how it makes you feel is going to determine how well you act. So here is this wonderful video. I'm going to let it run.
All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two.
Look how red his cheeks are. Oh, I mean, oh, that is so stressful, right? I mean, this kid is flushed, he's frustrated, he's almost angry, he can't believe he's in this difficult situation. That was really stressful, right? You can see the stress on his face and in his body and his autonomic nervous system, right? He's basically flushing, and he's showing you all these angry and stressed signals on his face, okay? That's when something feels good. Okay, what happens when something feels bad? Okay, so this is very preliminary, and I'm going to keep this pretty short now. So this is the task that Heather showed you. What happens if we take these validated angry and neutral faces and we make you do the same task with those, okay? So in one version, we've got you doing the task where the go trials, someone's looking with this really angry face, okay? And you have to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those in a row, and then you have to withhold a response when you see this neutral face. We also do it the other way around, okay, which is when you see lots and lots of neutral faces, not so bad, and then suddenly you have to withhold when you do the angry face. And it's angry and happy. They're 50-50. These are two separate experiments, and we get the kids, they know what they're doing. There's no rule switching here. If they have the rule, they do them completely separately. So we want to actually ask the question, you know, what happens when you're doing this task compared to the whack-a-mole task that you saw? And you already saw that some kids in the whack-a-mole task are doing just beautifully, and some other ones are not, okay? Now, I don't have good enough data to show you really how this all comes out right now, because we're very, very early on into this process. But what's our hypothesis? Our hypothesis is that if we have these kids who are sort of copers and strugglers, some kids are sort of really under this fight or flight mechanism because they're struggling hard in life and they're feeling threatened, then when you put them in this emotionally activated situation, like you saw with the threat bias test that Josh showed you, is that those kids really may struggle very hard. Okay, and they will lose further control. So what Josh showed you was that the control that these younger kids had and got later, they seem to be losing some of them under that circumstance because their attention is being drawn to stuff where it shouldn't be. They lose control over their orienting system. And so the question is, how much control do they lose under this situation here? So remember what we saw was that in Heather's example, the typical kids got better and better and better with more and more exposures to the GO trials, and that was not the case for the group. But in the group, you saw kids who looked just like the typical kids and some who were doing much, much worse. Okay? So let's take this one at a time. We've only got 7 kids with 22q deletion right now, and so we may be to try to bring some of your local kids in if potentially for test. So if you have a thing where the kids see 1 to 5 neutral faces, and then they have to do a no-go either to a happy or an angry, you can see that the profile, and it's pretty noisy, so you shouldn't take it too seriously because one kid can knock this off completely differently when you've got this many. But you can see that there's basically in both situations, so this is having 1 to 5 neutral faces and then a happy face where you're not supposed to press, or 1 to 5 neutral faces and an angry face, okay? And what you can see that the response here is about 75%, 70 to 75%, so it's about the same as here, okay? But they get a little bit better as a group. And the angry faces, they seem to be a little bit better not going when they see an angry face after they've seen a bunch of them. But there's not a whole lot of difference. And when we look at the kids, whether they have high anxiety or low anxiety on these standardized tests, there doesn't seem to be much of a relationship here. So this performance of just seeing the occasional angry or happy face within the task, what we call retroactive control, like this task over here, the moles and the vegetables, doesn't seem to be much affected by the anxiety level. Now, what if we reverse it? So this is what we call proactive control. You've got to try to keep your control while you're being faced with a pretty angry or a very happy face, okay? So now you're going to be very emotionally activated while you're trying to get your control in place. And what you can see here is that this is also fairly noisy. So this is 1 to 5 happy faces in pink or 1 to 5 angry faces in blue, and then you have to no-go to a neutral one. There's not a lot of difference between the angry and the happy faces. So the kids seeing the angry faces, 1 angry face, they seem to do a little bit worse, and it's much worse than here. But they're getting better. So the kids who see the happy faces, they're just getting better and better. They're not performing as well here. So it suggests that even here, there's some impact on the ability to do this. So maybe some of these kids who are anxious are looking away from that happy face towards the more neutral one. Well, there isn't a neutral one in this situation, but they're looking away from it. So they aren't doing so well, because you can see the performance level is much worse than it was here. But notice that when the kids have seen up 3 angry faces in a row, and then they have to no-go, they seem to be a lot better than typical kids, than the kids who have seen those happy faces. And there's some evidence in the literature that does suggest that when you see angry faces and you sort of really are activated by that, it's so much more salient and important to you, to come back to that word salience, that you really are sort of, that your threshold for responding is really changed. So we don't have really good data yet. But what this does suggest, and the preliminary data suggests when you look at this does seem to be, particularly this pattern here, seems to be true of the kids who are anxious. Okay? So that the anxiety is going to cut across this. So I can't give you a definitive statement, but what we do seem to find is that the salience, the hotness of how well the environment is suiting you, how well you feel fit to that environment, is going to modulate or mediate how well you can use your cognitive resources. So it isn't just about, can you press the button or not? It's like, how can you press the button when you're feeling really worked up or not? So that's going to be a modulator of how well you do. And very interestingly, Michelle Deng, who some of you saw talk last year, who was a postdoc with me, she's now back in China, Hong Kong, though she's still working on our data. She has this very interesting finding. Each row of these is an individual child, and we looked at ADHD as determined by a standard diagnostic test, not a formal diagnostic test, but done within our clinic. And the lighter the color, the lower the level of anxiety or ADHD that they had, and the hotter the color, the more that they had. And what you can see from all of these individual kids is that there is a group that doesn't seem to have neither anxiety nor ADHD who've come through our clinic. Okay, so they're not really suffering from either of those two things. There's a group who has a good deal of anxiety but no ADHD. There's a group who has a much smaller group who shows some ADHD and no anxiety. But the biggest group of all meets criteria for both anxiety and ADHD. And so the point is, in that initial task, the dot probe task, when you're anxious and you're stressed and you're threatened, then you start looking all around the place because you're trying to make sure that you're not in a dangerous situation. And that looks like ADHD. No one really knows what ADHD is, but it's defined by inattentiveness. So what have we learned by all of this? Well, what we've learned, I think, so far, is that key cognitive functions develop differently across childhood in all kids, right? And specifically even more so in 22q. And what information that you tend to process, what you use your cognitive resources for, depends on its salience or its importance. The problem is that that varies enormously across individuals and across circumstances, right? So if you're calm and collected, some things are going to seem more salient than others, and vice versa, all right? So the copers in our group are probably avoiding the threat, keeping their control under much better management, and they're learning better, and they're using their cognitive resources to advance. The strugglers probably are losing control and then deploying their cognitive resources sort of inefficiently and falling further and further behind. So I want to stress again, there's a bidirectional relationship between cognitive ability and anxiety. It's just not one drives the other. They're both influencing one another, okay? But doing better probably reduces anxiety and as competence improves. So the more competent you are, the less anxious you are, and the less anxious you are, the better competent, more competent you are, and vice versa. But doing worse also compromises your competence and therefore increases your anxiety, okay? So what are the short-term implications? Well, clearly quality of life. It feels very bad to be in this challenged situation for a long time. But social competence, academic progress, family dynamics, we're going to talk about all of this later on. These are things that we've learned from our clinic. And the longer-term implications are how well can you function independently? What's your employment possibilities? What are your relationship possibilities? What's your mental health possibilities? Because you need to be in optimal situations here. Now, each one of these things turns out to be somewhat amenable to intervention. And there's lots of well-validated, clinically available things here. And we're going to talk about some of them today. So what can you do? You can do a couple of things in the very short term. Is you can try to improve calibration. I'll say what I mean by that in a moment, in the last couple of minutes. And also use evidence-based therapies. I'm going to talk about evidence-based therapies after the break. So what I mean by calibration? What we mean when we talk in the clinic is that the copers and the strugglers seem to be defined by fit. What I mean by that is that the copers are kids who fit well to the environmental demands. Even if they have low levels of IQ or low levels of competence, what's being demanded of them minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, is well suited to their capabilities. And so they're actually deploying their resources effectively and continually moving forward. The ones who seem to be struggling are sort of trying to reach something that's always too far away from them, and they feel incapable of doing it, and they feel under tremendous biological stress, and we have measures of that biological stress, and that induces threat, which induces anxiety, and they just feel more and more hopeless and helpless, and often will give up and stop trying, okay? But that calibration can be adjusted. And there's evidence-based therapies when these things work. So what do I mean by that? This brings me back to the slide I started with last year. This was my first slide in last year's presentation. Children with a 22q deletion have uneven cognitive abilities. Some areas are much stronger than others and some are much weaker than others, and that varies a lot between individual kids. That's why our big comprehensive neuropsychological assessment that's part of our clinic tells us which kids which problems are specifically important for which kids, and that targets the things to intervene in, right? So you have to have that big comprehensive assessment done by an expert to know what things you want to target. That uneven set of capabilities is being challenged minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day from a set of ever-changing demands, some of which are easy and some of which are difficult for each individual child based on this set of abilities. And then they have coping resources. They have coping resources within themselves. They have coping resources within their family. They have coping resources within their school, within their friends, or they have the lack of them, right? And these things interact with one another constantly, all of the time. And so what we found, this fit notion, is this notion of the optimum stimulation curve. I talk about this. Basically, if there's one concept that explains everything, it's this. This seems to be the magic concept. So this is basically how much stimulation you have from very little to very much, and it can also relate to how much stress you have. So as you're on this side, if you're understimulated and there's no stress at all, you're just basically going to do nothing, snooze. You're going to be locked in a dark room, you're going to be doing nothing at all. You'll be understimulated, nothing happens. But as you get more stimulated, get more interested, you become more alert, you learn more, you feel better about yourself, you get mastery, you achieve things, you have positive motivation, things go well. Then there's this magical optimum stimulation. You're firing on all cylinders, everything that comes up in front of you, you're competent and capable of doing. You feel good, you feel great, you're moving forward, everything is positive. But imagine yourself at home or at work or at school, and everything is going great, and suddenly, zing, 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 your cell phone rings. Hey, you know that thing you were supposed to give me yesterday? You forgot to do it, and I need it right now. Oh, wait a minute, I can't because I'm working. Never mind, you got to get it. Ah! That just suddenly feels horrible. There's a whole kind of biological response to that situation. And that's okay for a short while, but when that becomes chronic, and you can look at Elliot Beaton's talks over the last few years of chronic stress, what that does, gradually you begin to feel anxious and worried. Am I going to get that situation again? When I have to go to math, what's it going to feel like? I hate going to math class. And so on and so forth, right? And then the things that are not supposed to be salient, like how scratchy your socks are and what the chair feels like and why that kid's looking at you funny, that starts to take over your world. And then you can't work well. And gradually you become completely disorganized and you lose control over the situation. Okay? So this can be changed. And this can be changed really by things like IEPs and home situation and school situation and social situation and expectations. And we're going to talk about that after the break. Okay? So there's a lot that can be done, and there are therapies for these kinds of things, and we're going to talk about those as well. So I think we're really beginning to see a big picture, holistic story about how this all fits together. And I think what that tells us is how we can think about risk and protective modulators of eventual outcome that could be changed on a regular basis, and the earlier we start, the better we are, but we can do this all the way along. So these people did all the work, but mostly you guys bringing your kids here taught us what we needed to know. Thanks.